Thank you, Miranda. So yesterday we looked at remote management, our role as managers, and the importance of recognizing the impact of not considering this challenge within your teams, right? What does it feel like when we're not together? What does it feel like when we need to be more intentional about our interactions? So what about unconscious bias, right? What is something that we can struggle with even more? If we feel like someone is not connecting with us, is not engaging, we tend to be dismissive. If someone tends to be negative or shooting down our ideas, we tend to categorize them and put them in a box. But I want to hear your thoughts. What, in the chat, or you can open your mic, what is unconscious bias to you? So you can drop that in the chat, or you can just open your mic. So what is unconscious bias? Perceptions based on experience. Thank you, Kristen. So unconscious bias is prejudice that is present, but not consciously held or recognized. And most of the time it does come from experiences, our upbringing, our culture, where we grew up. So it's just a body of all that. So how does unconscious bias affect organizations and our work? So that's another question I want to ask you. How do you think unconscious bias affects our organizations and our work? It can make you treat your coworkers unfairly. Cool. Anybody else have any thoughts? It can create blind spots. Yes. It affects the communication process 100%. And when unconscious bias is not addressed, it can affect the morale and the overall experience of the workers and even you. Right? And these workers, these teams may end up feeling alienated and also be less likely to make their ideas heard. So then we're perpetuating that behavior as well, right? If someone already is the no person, we won't want to talk to them, then they're already feeling excluded. So then they start, being these passive aggressive people, or just plain rude, or just disengaged. And then it's perpetuating that behavior as well. Okay. So why is being considerate of these differences still such a challenge for us in the 21st century? And the reality is because we're still dealing with the inherent stereotypes and the biases that we grew up with, that we've learned, that we've experienced, right? Passing comments can stick in our minds. We grew up with labeling to help us understand and digest the world around us, which is an important trait that we do as children. We label things, we label the color, we label, the grass, we label everything in order for us not to feel overwhelmed. But it's how the media and even our own nurturing creates those definitions for us, and it continues through our lives. And then it creates these biases later. Okay. And as a manager, the opposite of being inclusive is being dismissive. And we use our stereotypes and biases to be dismissive of people. And in some ways, use it as a way to excuse both our reactions and their contributions. And this is not limited to those who are different from us. Women have these biases about other women. Ethnic groups have that bias regarding their own ethnic groups. And so it's not just, it's everywhere. The bias is everywhere, right? So it's hard to rewire, but it's important to bring the unconscious to the conscious. So being intentional. So how can we make ourselves aware when bias might be at play and make a conscious effort or habit about addressing it? So there are week-long trainings, honestly, on bias and inclusion. We're kind of scratching the surface to make sure that you understand that as a manager, we need to be aware of bias and be inclusive and try to bring that to the forefront and be intentional, all right? So we're here to help recognize that there is a bias, and sometimes we ourselves can be biased, but the key is, how do we deal with it? How are we intentional about it? So let me give you an example. I had a director, an actual executive director of an organization that I was working at, not wanting to approve telework way before COVID, before telework was a reward, if you will, right? She did not want to approve, and it was a she did not want to approve the telework of any staff person that had young children, because she thought that they were not going to be working and that they were going to be taking care of their children instead of working from home. So I had to have a very serious conversation, because I was also a mother with young children, with our director, to have to try to make her understand that that starts creating favoritism, right? And it's also this big bias, and her being a woman, a mother, a grandmother, to start thinking that that's what people are going to do from home, and not realizing that just because also someone's sitting in the office doesn't mean they're going to be productive and that they're working, right? So all these things were happening all at once. So I had to have this difficult conversation, kind of help her see the situation and come up with policies and procedures that were equitable and fair. So it wasn't based on your home situation, it was based on the individual, the tasks that needed to be involved, the conversation with the supervisors of how to manage that workload or the expectations of what was going to be done working from home, so that we can remove this layer or this bias, this bad assumption that because people had young children, especially the women, they were not allowed to work from home remote. So that was huge. That was very huge, right? But we turned that into a positive. It was very challenging. How can you have those conversations with the executive director? Like, listen, what you're doing is not right. But then we created policies and procedures to make it all standard. Okay. So this is just about being aware, but it's also helping others in our team and our organization be aware that they might be being biased at the moment. Okay, I see the chat hopping real quick. Hold on. Yes, Rebecca, yikes. My question, Robert asked, Roberto asked, but my question is, if this have to be with some kind of accountability, it is necessary to have some accountability groups. Yes, so that's more of a human resources also function, right? To make sure that the policies of the organization are equitable, are fair, and are just for everyone. There are times, even now, when we had to, a lot of us went remote for COVID, there were some positions that cannot be remote, right? Like security guards or folks that are doing maintenance in certain buildings or organizations. So how do you create a system that is clear, transparent on who or what kind of jobs, not the person, but what kind of jobs have to be remote or could be remote, have to be in person, or at least the minimum days in person. So it's all about your systems and your procedures. And then it's training your management team on how to work with those within those rules and how to enforce it and be consistent. That's the key thing too, consistency. You're not going to allow someone to work out of another country when the policy is that you shouldn't, and then not allow the next person to do that. So once you allow one person to do something, that's just, you have to be equitable with everyone. Okay, so there are those accountabilities. We're accountable for ourselves, and human resources should help the organization as a whole be accountable as well. Rebecca, one phrase or question I've really appreciated in ensuring equity is asking for whom to any statement. Yes. So Rebecca, actually, do you want to open your mic real quick and just share with us like an example of a policy or a time that you've had to, like apply that?
Yeah, absolutely. Like one example is thinking about like a a local gathering place in the community, like even outside of work, saying, we want this to be an accessible, welcoming place. For whom is that? For people that have wheelchairs. Thinking about accessibility in that place of like, who is this? Is this accessible for returning citizens who have criminal records? Are they able to come and participate in this place? Like, I just remember learning this from someone, and it just struck me every time saying, for whom, which implicitly is asking, who is this not for, to help us see and build empathy and awareness to our neighbors.
That's awesome. I like that. That's really great. I'm gonna have to use that. But it's true, right? Because sometimes we're honestly caught up in our bubbles about everything, right? And we think everyone has the same opportunities, or we don't think what somebody else might be going through or can access or can participate in. So we don't think about it. And it's not because we're choosing to be unkind on purpose. It's just because we sometimes don't have the mental space to have the level of self-awareness or just step out of our shoes for a moment, right? So I like that you suggested that. That's really helpful. Anybody else have any thoughts or comments on bias or unconscious bias? Okay, we are going to get into groups right now. I really want you all in groups. We're going to get into groups of 4 to 5, and we're going to answer the following questions that are on page 14 of your workbook. As a manager and a leader, a position of power, where do you have the opportunity to include or exclude? Right? Is it hiring, inviting people to meetings, calling them on meetings to share their ideas? And how can you and your team take the steps to be more aware of when you may be expressing bias? And what can you do to check each other's biases? Okay, these are on page 14 of your workbook. Miranda's going to work her magic. You're going to get in groups for about 7 minutes or so, and just have those discussions as a team, because it's now, how do we make this more actionable? How do we make this more real to our situations at work? Okay. There you go, Miranda.
Lady, there you go.
All right. Welcome back, everyone. Who wants to share some of the key ideas that you discussed in your groups? What are some things that we can do to help eliminate bias, check our own biases or our team's bias?
Are you specifically looking at the second point, Francesca?
Either, whatever you all want to share.
So we were in group 2. It was me, Jenica, Matt, and Lisa. And in areas of inclusivity, we had that so you could be inclusive in areas of hiring, creating spaces and meetings, being inclusive of the people you supervise, continually asking people for opinions and feedbacks. Benefits was an interesting one, to ensure equity somehow with people when they're located across different countries. Inclusion in terms of people of all abilities, and ensuring space to bring people together. And then to minimize expressing bias, most of our examples fell into feedback in one way, shape, or form. So either asking for feedback or ensuring that you ask for feedback through different channels, whether it's online or phone calls, emails, etc. Having time to self-reflect and think about your own behavior, and having a sparring partner to really ask, is what I'm doing crazy? Am I seeing this wrong? And just having, that time to have a reality check.
That's great. Thank you so much. Anybody else have any thoughts? Something resonated from what Kristen said? I saw some head nods, but feel free to open your mic.
Those are some really helpful suggestions. And in our group with JP, Roberto, and Jimena, we talked about how each of us have unconscious biases that we need help becoming more aware of. And so we can take the initiative to educate ourselves about what those unconscious biases may be, and then share the education and learning of what we've learned about that with others as well, to help eliminate other unconscious biases in our teams.
Yeah, those are great points. One thing that we need to also keep in mind, and I think I mentioned it briefly during day one, is that, you know, our work is international, right? And so realizing that also the cultures and the countries that we work in, there might be things that we just don't know. Not that we're being biased, but they're just things that we may not be aware. And I'll give you an example. So we were working in a country in Africa. We were having some challenges, some management challenges, because there was a situation between the different tribe groups that were working together in the office. And we weren't realizing that that was a situation. So instead of us coming from the, you know, the States to come do some HR training on team building, we brought in someone from the area to lead and facilitate with us some HR trainings about team building, working together. So realizing those cultural nuances that we might not be aware of are very important as well in this whole conversation of inclusion and bias, because we're stepping out of our shoes, we're understanding the dynamics in the places where we get to work and the colleagues that we get to work from all over the world. And we help create a very inclusive, non-hostile work environment for everyone, right? Also recognizing that some cultures, like I mentioned before, are not comfortable speaking up or sharing ideas. So exactly what you were saying, Kristen, allowing that space and pooling of what's your feedback, what are your thoughts, and really bringing that in instead of taking it that they don't want to be included, they're not engaged, and being open for everyone is very, very important. Okay. Any other thoughts about this conversation or topic?
I actually thought of something else. I think like as a manager, it's important to speak up when you feel uncomfortable about something. And I have a good example of this. At my organization, we recently had a very, very poorly done DEI training, virtual training with our headquarters, so people in the US, the UK, and then country directors. And one of the co-presidents actually was very vocal and spoke up when she was uncomfortable about some of the questions that were being asked. And I thought that that was really important because it kind of goes to creating space for people. Like it's okay to speak up if something doesn't sit well with you. And yeah, so I just think like, when you're higher up in an organization or, you know, it's important it goes a long way to speak up and say something.
Yeah. And I think that's a great point because it's not only, you know what they say, it's like when you ask a question, you're probably asking the question for somebody else that might have the same question, but it's not speaking up. But I think it's also important to approach all these topics on inclusion and all the isms, right? The racisms, favoritisms, all these things that happen sometimes in organizations. Also with some humbleness, right? Because we don't know everything. We may really never understand what someone's going through or the situation that they're experiencing. And feeling comfortable to also ask, why is that an issue? Or what is your experience is just as important to sharing when something is uncomfortable for you or someone's doing something that is creating bias, right? So so thank you for bringing that up, Danica, because I think it's very, very important that we also feel comfortable asking the questions. You know, I really don't understand. Like, how can you explain it to me? You know? So a lot of organizations, especially in the United States, because of everything that have been happening in the last couple of years, both politically and you know, some issues about racism and social injustice and things like that, a lot of organizations started having these inclusion bias conversations about systemic racism and how systems have been created in a certain way and having those open conversations. But they also allowed space to ask questions from people that would have never experienced what others may be experiencing or just didn't understand. And it really helped bring people together in a comfortable open space to not judge each other and really share experiences and questions, right? So allowing that space for us also as managers to create that space for our staff is very important, or speak up when there is bias around and make someone aware. Like the example I gave you about the director not allowing remote work for mothers, essentially, right? So that was an issue, and bringing that up and coming up with a solution as well, or your point of view of how can it be addressed is also very important, right? Because it's all about action driven. So there are a lot that can be done about bias and inclusion, but most of the tools and techniques we will cover in this workshop will work to override some of these biases, right? If you consider everyone as an individual. So think back to situational leadership, right? No one style fits everyone, but you're basing your style on your bias as well. So keep this in mind as you work through together the next couple of days of how can we start peeling back some of these layers and really look at the individuals as individuals, right? And not their behavior sometimes. Their behavior causes bias too. So Humentum does have like a learning platform for members to have access to eCornell courses on inclusion and unconscious bias. I can drop that in the chat. If your organization is a member organization of Humentum, you get free access to some of those eCornell courses. And like I said, some courses are like week long, some are like ongoing workshops, but we're just trying to scratch the surface here and trying to pinpoint how we can prevent some of these biases or be more aware of them as we are leading teams and growing professionally in our organizations, but also taking that to us in our personal lives. Sometimes we have bias against our own family members. So how do we work through that as well and try to give everyone a fair shot and chance, okay? So that was finishing our last piece of conversation from yesterday's session about who we are as managers and our role as managers. And today we're going to start going into managing from the middle. All of us are managing from the middle. We have someone that we report to. We have also team members that report to us. And that is also a very challenging situation to be in because, parts of being a manager is the fact that you can often find yourself in the middle. And there's, like I told you, there's someone above you, there's someone underneath you. And that is why it's so important to understand what your role is, right? In your structure, in your organization, because it often changes depending who you're speaking to. If you're speaking to your supervisor, the way you need to communicate or sometimes share ideas is very different than when you're leading your team. So being aware what role you play and also how you communicate is also very important, okay? So we need to effectively communicate up and down and have the skills to influence others, right? It's not all about authority. We're not like, just because you got to do it because I'm the boss, right? That's not how it works. Is how do you then finesse your communication, your motivation, being a supportive manager into leading your team and creating the change that you want to see or completing the tasks or the work that you want to see. So in this section, we're going to focus on understanding the importance of intent versus influence, how to effectively communicate up and down, and practice creating influence strategies. And that's what we're going to focus on today. Okay. Let me see where else. Perfect. I'm going to share my screen really quick. Awesome. So communicating up and down, right? People's perception of you are not just based on your actions and reactions, but they're also based on the role you play in any given relationship. So like it or not, every relationship has a power dynamic that influences how messages get received. And communication is hard, right? It is not just about delivering a message, it's also about how you receive the message. We miscommunicate in the best of times, but then layer on power dynamics and remote working in different cultures, language barriers, and then messages can get distorted. So, those who are in power have less of an ability to take the perspective of others. Why is that? Because they don't need to do it often. And so they get out of practice of understanding others. So the more powerful you feel, the worse you are at taking others' perspectives. The least powerful you feel, the better you are at seeing the world from other people's points of view, because you need to do that. So power and status can actually distort worldviews. And of course, this translates to communication. And because of this, and because most of us are managing from the middle, it is important to remember that how you communicate up is different than how you communicate down. Okay, managers are seen like communicating with a megaphone. When your manager hat is on, everything you say has greater weight, even informal opinions during friendly conversations. Keep that in mind. And the higher your position, the greater the distortion. So you don't get to think out loud sometimes without thinking about the impact of your words. Okay. So let's take a little example. There's a team in the organization that's getting a bad reputation for not being efficient and effective. So the manager comes in and says, from now on, we're going to be the yes team. That's all he says. So what does that do? That results with everyone saying yes to everything, which then leads to wasting time, focusing, not prioritizing on things, helping everyone on anything, but not the things that are important to the group or the organization. So his intention about being open and helpful and having good customer service created a situation of chaos in the team, because now they're just supposed to help wherever, right? So there's different ways they could have communicated that. Instead of saying, from now on, we're going to be more efficient, we're going to provide best customer service, we're going to communicate with our teams and have more of a structure instead of just saying yes to everything. Okay. And on the other side, you have the employee gramophone. Yeah, it's a cone to your ear that magnifies the message. We can sometimes do this with our donors, with our headquarter offices, if we are in other remote offices around the world. Their word can be construed as the law of the land. We don't ask questions. We sometimes don't second guess what they're telling us to do. We'll just do it because they said so. And that's not how it works. Okay. When miscommunication happens, your initial reaction might be that of, that's not what I said. And it honestly doesn't matter, because as a manager, you have a greater responsibility to make sure that there's a clear communication and understanding of what you're saying. And there's a difference between intent and impact. And the manager is responsible for both. Okay, so frame your conversations of my intention is. So like that, yes manager, he should have said, my intention is for us to be the most agile and responsive team we can be and provide the best customer service. And the team will then understand what they're trying to do. Okay. Also remember, communication can be body language. So be mindful of that when you're in meetings, when you're in-person meetings or in Zoom meetings. Okay. There's those typical movie scenes where someone's doing a presentation and then all of a sudden, someone's doing a pitch and their executive director's there, and then everybody else turns to that executive director. It's the same thing. Everyone's looking to see what the manager is doing. So keep in mind your nonverbal cues as well. Okay. Any examples that anybody wants to share about communicating up or down, or thoughts? Okay. We are going to get into some groups to think a bit more about communication. So we're going to get into groups of 3 to discuss a time when you have had your message distorted and what happened, or when you found out that you had distorted someone else's message. Okay, so we're going to get into groups for a little bit. Let's think about communication and the impacts of these messages getting distorted and why that happened. And then we'll get back and discuss it as a group. So Miranda is gonna put you all in groups for about 6 minutes, not too long, so we can have some of these conversations.
Perfect. There you go.
See you soon. All right. Welcome back, everyone.
All back.
Thank you. So who wants to share some of the discussion? Why do messages get distorted, or what happened in that situation? Don't jump in all at once now.
Well, to break the silence, because I like
Thank you.
communication and want to learn from people. So please stop talking more. We had 2 examples that came up in our group, and the one was about came from Matt, and he said that they ended up putting a percentage in their budgeting and their forecasting, and that led managers to think that all staff members were entitled to this certain percentage, which obviously created a frenzy when it came to their financial planning and everything. And the second message that was miscommunicated was with grants, and when local teams who are planning something have a different understanding of donor communications than maybe a headquarter office. And that trickles down and doesn't necessarily roll out the way that you want it to. And Jenica said that actually happens quite a lot. Matt also confirmed. So maybe for all those people working on grants and proposal development, this might sound like something very similar to you as well.
That is a very true example. That happens all the time. So yeah, awesome. And so why do these miscommunications happen? Why do you all think this happens? I mean, some of it is not intentional, right? I mean, it's not we're gonna go out there and like mess people's budgets up on purpose. But so what is it? Why do we think this happens?
At least on the second example I gave, since it's from my organization, I know how it worked. The different people in different managerial or decision-making positions have different perceptions of how processes should work. So to put that into a context, we have country offices. I'm based in Austria, and we have country offices with their own teams, with their own country directors who make the decisions at local level. And the country director had a 5-year grant. The donor said, we'll renew it in that country, which was unusual. And the country director promised all the partners to continue rolling over the project into a second 5-year phase. The donor changed its requirements, changed the focus of the project, and therefore it couldn't just be a business as usual continuation. We knew this because headquarters communicates with the donors, the country offices do not. Just that, you could say that that's an organizational question, a systemic challenge, but it's one that exists. That's a reality for us, that we have country offices who have direct communication with partners, and then at headquarter level we communicate with donors, and there's a separation between those two. So here we're talking about managing in the middle, and now you're really talking about being the middleman between these different entities, but completely missing the communication linkages. So I think that that's one of the, just different perceptions and different visions for different people in decision-making power. And people just go off and make different decisions as they understand it.
Exactly. So communication is key, right? Clear expectations is key. So most of the time it happens by accident. We're busy. People are busy. Don't always take our time to have the thoughtful or intentional communication that we would like to have with our teams, with our partners, with our country offices. So that right there is a breakdown of communication. So I know everybody's like, let's multitask. But now in reality, research has come out that says single tasking is actually healthier for your neurons and your brain. So it's interesting how we need to reprogram ourselves in a way to be more present and more aware and more intentional about the conversations that we're having, So then we can make sure that everyone that is supposed to be part of this, is aware, and we don't have those issues, right? Some of it, right, creates big budgetary issues and a huge programmatic issue, but other things are just even affecting our team and our morale and just the way we communicate. So it's very interesting. Ximena, go ahead.
Hi, and I wanted to add a couple of things.
Sure.
Not a specific example, but for example, in my case, I was born in San Francisco, raised in El Salvador. Now I'm DC based, approved remote. But my train of thought, everything comes to me. My first language is Spanish. And so I could also add in language barriers or clear information, because I really have to think about what I'm going to say when I want to translate my ideas, especially in international development. I'm fully fluent in Spanish, technical language, but translating that into efficient communication and clear guidelines when designing concepts for a DRL, for example, is more complicated. And so I would definitely add in that language barrier as well. And then maybe also like vague information that doesn't necessarily fully trickle down into tangible deliverables. You have these inspirational speeches about, division leadership or front office VPs or whatever, but that philosophy doesn't necessarily translate into what do you want from us, like deliverable wise or task wise, like how do we basically distribute or bring in results, to basically match that philosophy.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I feel like that's why we need to sometimes stop and be intentional so that we can think about these things, not only the way we communicate, but the way that, who we're communicating with is also important, right? And what could get lost in translation, or what could just be lost because they're not on our brains and we think we're saying something. And I'm like, I can't read your mind. You know what I mean? Or you start off, that happens all the time, not just at work, but let's say there's an idea in your mind and you start just going at it and the person's like, what are you talking about? And it's because you had a thought about something and they're just coming into like that thought that you had, but they don't understand the context of your thought as well. So that happens a lot. And the reason it happens because we're too busy. We're trying to multitask. We're like on the phone, on the computer. We're trying to, answer someone's instant message or whatever the case may be, and trying to work across different type of tasks or projects instead of just focusing and doing a checklist. Okay, this is everything I needed to do for this. Now we can move on and go to something else. But because we're in this constant multitasking, sometimes we can't finish the task that we need to do, or we miss a step, right? So, it even happens when you're reading an email. That's a whole nother conversation, right? Writing email and reading emails. You probably read the first couple lines, you're assuming is about something and you're responding. And then after the person's like, that's not what I was asking. Again, because we're rushing, And now add remote work to the situation. So we need to be a lot more intentional to be and feel connected to our teams and our organizations so that we can work better together and understand those nuances. Like Ximena, her train of thought is first in Spanish. So I got to make sure that I'm spelling, the acronyms. I'm not using acronyms or thinking she knows our structure, things like that. Or working in other offices that they understand how we speak to the donors all the time and how we build on budgets. So set up some habits that will allow you to be more intentional about connecting with your teams and getting to know each other better, to understand who everyone is, their preferred communication style or the best communication style that you can have with them. And that personal connection and understanding helps the working relationship, because we tear down those preconceived notions or bias or thinking that everyone knows what we know. And it improves our communication and our understanding of one another. And it allows for better communication. Okay? So being present, being intentional, and we'll talk a little bit about active listening tomorrow. How do we practice doing that? So let's talk a little bit more about managing up. Let's see, Chris says, I would love to learn more ways to take language barriers into account when communicating with each other. And it's being intentional, Chris, to be honest with you, is really being aware that, who we're speaking with within our teams. You know, the US too is also very multicultural. So you can have people from different cultures or backgrounds in your team. So it's not just the teams abroad, but, and they also have to be aware that you may not understand as Americans or Westerners, everything or the dynamics that happens in the country. So it's just being aware and being intentional about knowing who is in your team and who you're communicating with, and not making assumptions that everyone either knows something or operates the same way. And I did have a good question here. It says, I'm curious, at some point could we discuss aspects of being on the receiving end of lots of challenging feedback from our place in the middle, and how to manage that and own what's ours, and how to steward feedback from our staff, from which responding is above our level. It's just finding it exhausting and would love to learn some ideas. Yeah, so it's kind of like advocating for your team, right? So we're going to talk a little bit now about managing up. So we can circle back to this, but I would say understanding all the players within your organization, your managers, understanding your team, what everybody needs, and how to really pull back all these layers on seeing what resources or who you need to contact to help the team is very important. So let's talk a little about managing up, and then we'll come back to this point on how do we handle advocating for our team from the middle, if you will, and when is it a good point to pull in some resources, because we may not have all the answers or the authority to make some of these changes or decisions. Okay, so for homework yesterday, I asked you to complete page 17. Hold on, I see that the chat's going. Kristen says, also at Chris, a tip recently received was at the end of the meeting or call or even via email, asking everyone if they can quickly confirm their to-dos. It then helps to show if people did understand what was said and agreed upon. Yeah, follow-up emails or follow-up conversations in writing is always a good approach. So that's a good one, Kristen. We do that a lot for feedback. After you're giving feedback to folks, we ask you to follow up with them on an email to just say, make sure we understand your goals, make sure you understand the timelines. But if you want to do that for tasks and stuff, that's very, very helpful after your check-ins. And don't forget your check-ins. That's also the time to do that. Some staff may need weekly check-ins, some staff may need monthly check-ins, but have those points of contact where you're clarifying conversation. So this is great. Love it when you all share tips with each other. So yesterday we asked you to, I asked you to work on page 17 of the workbook, and I want to hear a little bit about how that went for you. So by a show of hands, were you able to complete all the questions for the boss section or your manager section? You can either raise your hand if you have your camera on, or you could just use the hand emoji. So it's like, most, okay. Okay. Rebecca's like, no. Okay. So how were you able to answer the questions for you? Were you able to answer all the questions about you? Yes. Still some like, sometimes. Okay, a little bit. Okay. So I'm going to ask you this. Why do you think you weren't able to answer every question about your manager? There's no wrong or right, but why do you think you weren't able to answer the questions about your manager or yourself? Oh, don't be shy. Does everybody have these kind of conversations with their manager? Have you paid attention to some of these things about your manager? How about yourself? Roberto says, I read the sentence that says the quality of communication determines the quality of the relationship. Yes. 100%. And also paying attention, right? Just being aware, not just, there's a difference of what they also say, like, you could all be in the same house, but if everyone's on an electronic or everybody's doing the same thing, you're still not together. You're still not paying attention to each other. You're still not interacting. So that could also happen at work. You're just going by day to day, right? So if we don't take the time, Roberto, did you want to say something?
No, well, I think it's I think more in the time to spend with your team and your manager determine the quality of the communication. If you don't have spend time with them, the communication maybe will be distorted and maybe can understand how you can say even in internal communication like email or something, if the people doesn't know you yourself and doesn't spend time with you, maybe they can understand how you talk or why you say something. I think is the most important the relationship and the quality of that.
Yes, communication is key, right? And being intentional about building and having good communication. So Sheila put on the side of the manager, one would have to pay so much attention to determine how to align your work ethics. Yeah, yes and no, right? Because if you're, we're not, I mean, the whole point is that you don't need to be like super detailed on everything and align on every level, but you kind of know when your manager is going to be one of those managers that are going to advocate for you or that they're not. You just know this, right? Based on have you observed their interactions and their interactions with others. You'll know if your manager doesn't like conflict because you see how they also act. So a lot of it too is observing how they interact with others. But the thing is sometimes that now this hybrid or remote work situation doesn't allow for us or doesn't make it as easy for us to figure out who people are, especially your managers, unless we're very intentional about our conversations. Kristen, go ahead.
I just wanted to share something that I learned in a workshop that my team did back in April. An organization came in and did something where they taught us about quadrants, communication quadrants or personality quadrants. And you could be a relationship person where your work is based off of building relationships. You could be a thinker where you first have to perceive and take the information in before you can feel about it. So kind of an emotional connection to it. There were the action-oriented people who needed to immediately have checklists and do things. And then there's the fourth type, which is knowing the big picture. So having structures, having your structure base. And the biggest outcome or thing that stayed with me from this, we ended up doing this over 2 days, I think, 2 full days, with 3 follow-up sessions. But the main takeaway was when we divided ourselves into the different quadrants and we saw where everyone in our team stood, and then learning how those people need to communicate and how you can run a meeting or a session or group work in a way that leaves everyone the space to be able to understand. So if you're an action-oriented person, simply having a game plan at the beginning could be enough to set the scene for them, as well as the person who needs structure. They need to see, how does this fit in? Why are we doing this? What's the value? And then also, if you present something, sitting back and giving people 1 minute or 2 to reflect so they can absorb. And then you just have to make sure you think about all the types that are maybe outside of your own. And that for me was extremely helpful. And I've reverted back to that several times since that training. So maybe that's.
No, that's great. And that's the thing, there's a lot of different assessments or models that we can talk about, but it's not just communication, it's also learning, right? Think about when you have someone new in your team, some people are hands-on, some people like to see it, they're very visual. So it's the same thing with communication. Some people just don't work with the email communication. They need to have the verbal connection, right? And I think the points that Kristen brings about are interesting because there are very other different platforms of like, how do you learn, how do you communicate, but it's what you do with that, right? And how do you apply it? But being aware, if you don't have those type of resources to get those models, is just being aware that think of you. How do you like to communicate? How do you like to be communicated to? How do you like to learn? And know that others are thinking the same or have a different style as well. And being aware of that helps you to communicate and work differently. And it's all about that level of awareness, as you know. So when you're communicating with your boss, it's important to understand where they're coming from, understand their stressors, and that's not going to come out. Some of it is going to be visual. You're going to just pick it up based on their interactions, but some of it is really intentional conversations, you know. So I'm going to share my screen real quick. Is, you know, understanding your boss is about also understanding what are their goals and objectives, having that conversation with them, right? What is it that they're overseeing so that you understand how it also rolls up to you. Now, a good manager will share that with you. These are the organizational goals. These are my goals. These are our unit's goals. And this is how everybody trickles up, right? They should be doing some of that. Understanding the stressors. If they're managing budgets and they're constantly trying to meet that bottom line, that's going to be a stressor. You need to understand what is happening to within the organization and ask, where can I help? Where can I come in to support? And that's how you start building trust as well with your supervisor, right? What are the expectations? Do you know what they expect from you, right? As their direct report, what kind of working relationship do they like? How do they like to communicate? Kind of what Kristen was saying. Are they the manager that wants all the details, or they just want the big picture? Yes, this was done and this is the outcome. Or they want the whole layout of the land of how you got to your decision. So those are all the things that you need to be aware or ask. How do you like me to communicate with you? Okay, and the expectations is super important because you want to know what they're expecting of you, so then you understand how you need to present your work or the tasks that you need to take on, or how much autonomy you're going to have to do your work and lead your team as well. Okay. Communication style is super important. So are they good listeners? Are they big picture? Are they more of a hands-off delegator type of manager? Okay, or are they more hands-on micromanager that you're gonna have to get them to trust you and warm up to you and understand your capabilities? So developing and managing relationships, understanding your boss and yourself, all of these aspects that we talked about in this page can help you both develop and maintain a strong relationship, because it's all based on trust and confidence. And it's essential. Those two are very important to keeping a good relationship. So understanding yourself and your boss can go a long way in providing that you are dependable and preventing misunderstanding and conflict. And you have to take the time to get to know your boss, just like you do your team. Okay. Again, we're not out here to be best friends, but how do we have a level of understanding and a personal level of understanding of each other? So being aware of both of your strengths and your weaknesses will help guide you and give you an idea of how to move forward to benefit both of you, right? We talked about how to create opportunities for us and for our own growth, while understanding where are some areas that you can support your boss as well. What are some things that they do that you might be interested in learning and mastering when you move forward, right? So, and respecting each other's time. Only make requests when they're necessary. If you can do it yourself, don't waste your time, don't waste their time. Building trust and being trustworthy are important. So practice being dependable. Don't overpromise. Some of us are yes people and overpromise because we just want to help, right? So don't do that. Really take into consideration how long it takes to complete something. Acknowledge when you make a mistake. Learn from each other. Right? So just that, the level of truth and honesty. And remember, speak the language of power, right? Of those that you seek to influence. In order to do that, you need to understand them. So what does it mean by the language of power? Is that you're being intentional and you're being upfront and honest with the way that you're speaking and communicating. Okay. So again, not that these can be done all, and it all depends also on your manager and what type of person they are and how open they are, but at least trying to understand what makes them tick is very important. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen real quick, but I want to share a story with you. I have a bunch of examples, by the way. So very early on in my career, I had a very interesting boss. This was my first like official job, and I was on eggshells for the first 6 months. I literally thought I was going to get fired every day for 6 months. I was very young in my career, just started out, and it was because my boss I couldn't connect with her. I was trying to do my job. I thought I was doing my job, but then with the feedback that I was getting wasn't a positive feedback. And I'm like, I don't understand. So we weren't able to build that personal relationship to understand each other. So it was getting really hard because I didn't understand her. So I realized that she was an after hours, like once 5:30 hit, she was more relaxed. She wasn't all about business. So I was able to have conversations with her. So I realized that I now needed to stay a little later if I wanted to start building that relationship with her and getting to know her. And we did. After 6 months of a lot of tears and a lot of like nervous ulcers, we ended up building a great relationship. It took from me as a junior staff person to get to know her and make the adjustments that I needed. And she ended up being one of the best supervisors that I've ever had, and actually is still one of my mentors. But it took a lot to get there, right? I could have dismissed it. I could have said, I'm going to give up. I don't want to be in this environment, and just quit and moved on. But I decided that I really liked the job, and I'm going to see what I could do to help the situation. I'm going to give it my all and then decide if this is the place for me, because it might have not been. And that's okay too. Removing yourself from a situation that's not good for you, or that doesn't make you be the person that you want to be, is okay. But I gave it a fair shot, and it was great. It took a lot. But I tell you this because sometimes our managers are not going to be very forthcoming in how they're going to build a relationship with us. And it's going to take a lot of time and effort from us to do that. So I say this also, so don't be the manager you don't want to have, right? So I am the total opposite with my staff and my team. I have an open door policy. I thank them for the work at the end of the day, even though we all get paid to be there, but I just like, hey, thanks so much for your effort. Let me know if I can help with something. I try to be engaged a little bit and understand all the personal, what's going on in the family. How can we help? What do you need? Celebrate accomplishments. But that's the manager I want to be, right? So pay attention to some of the traits about your manager, what works, what doesn't, and this is how you should communicate. It's going to take sometimes a lot more from you, but it's going to be a very rewarding experience because it's going to help your working relationship. Big time. All right, I see some comments. Roberta says, perhaps it also has to do with the type of team, the size, the objectives, or the tasks to be carried out. Yes. A smaller family-like organization is going to have a very different dynamic and communication style than a very large international organization where everybody is in a department or a specific job. It's going to be very different. Where can I find more information on work style and communication? I'll look up some stuff, Cohen, I'll share with you. And in the teamwork, what are some different ways to identify stressors? My team had a table of people to fill out, put on the spot. No one came up with anything, and there are more creative ways to inputs from people. Yes, we can talk about that. And we can definitely, as we're talking about the forming of the teams, you will see some of the, inherent stressors that happen in a team as the teams are forming, and how can we help move our teams along through those stages. Okay, so we'll definitely circle back to those 2 points. So let's talk a little bit about influencing without authority, which sometimes happens when we're managing from the middle. So at the end of the day, managing up is the start of an informal influence strategy. It's all about creating a win-win situation. A win for you is a win for the person you're seeking to influence, and win for the broader team or mission. So on the chat, tell me what you all think authority is. What is authority to you? Oh, I think I just messaged one person. So what is authority to you? Just drop it on the chat or open your mic. the ability to make a final decision. Okay. So boss, right? Power to make decision. Final decision making, influence, and power to make decisions. Okay. What is influence? So JP says the same thing. It's a power that a person has received, but the leader has more than authority. They have influence. Aha. So what is this influence? I don't know why it looks so distorted, but what is this influence that we're talking about? How would you describe influence? Ability to inspire others, getting to know people, getting people on board with your ideas or persuasion. Yes. Ability to motivate, guide, changing culture, direction, organization, and getting people on board. 100%. Awesome. I'm going to share my screen real quick. So people in authority can get resources and grant permissions. People with influence can create the change or have effects in tangible or intangible ways. So either in action or ideas. And it requires working through others and good communication skills. So it needs to have a certain level of awareness and awareness about others. So a lot of self-awareness and awareness of our teams and others when we want to influence. So what makes us influential, right? Influence is about reciprocity, the give and the take. It is a simple concept, but super difficult sometimes. So how do we do it? Being influential means discovering and using our currencies effectively. I'm not saying we're going to bribe people and pay them. That's not what I mean by currency. I don't mean money. But in our professional life, whether we know it or not, we all have some form of power or something to offer, okay? Because we all possess currencies. So again, you might not think of trust or caring with your family as a currency, but it is. Think of currency as something valuable that you have that you can trade for something that you want or need, right? Currency is something of value. It's resources that can be exchanged. It is the basis for acquiring influence. And in terms of work, it's things that you have or that you can do for people. And they both have to match. So currency is based on the principle that if you do something for a colleague, there's a good chance that they will do something for you in return. So the trick is to be able to offer currency that the person values. So again, it's not as calculated and strategic and transactional as it sounds when you're thinking currency, but it's also more about that give and take, right? That we're trying to do. So being trustworthy, being reliable, being dependable, those are currencies to different people within your organization. So the first thing we need to know is, what do we have to offer? And sometimes we don't think we have anything valuable to offer, but we do. Okay, our time is valuable. Okay, our willingness to help others on the weekends or there's something of emergency, being the go-to person when someone comes to us because they have a problem and they need some counseling, that's also a currency. Okay. Any thoughts about currency? So why don't we drop in the chat some of the currencies that you think you have to offer? Or if you want, you can open your mic. So what are some of these currencies? Honesty, the willingness to help, train, and onboard. Yes. And honesty is a big one too, because you don't want to be the yes person. Someone wants to go to you because they'll know you'll be honest with them. If something's going to work or it's not going to work or it's a good idea. Institutional knowledge, that's huge for an organization, especially that's had a lot of new folks come in or if there's been a merger. Institutional knowledge is big. Transparency, yeah, honesty, transparency, Empathy. For some projects and under certain circumstances, being able to walk the extra mile, yes. Experience. My team members know I am on their side, trustworthy, yes, trust. And for a manager, that's huge, that your team can trust you. You know, and flexibility, yeah, that's huge, especially for an organization. They'll really value that. So one of the things, as you're also thinking of your manager and influencing up or influencing without authority, understanding the areas, I don't like the word weakness, but the areas where your boss doesn't have strength. And what are the ways you can compensate by providing support for those areas, right? Maybe your boss doesn't have the time to onboard folks, but you do. You're able to do that. Maybe there's a project or an emergency that's happening and you have flexibility to work and go the extra mile for that job because they don't have that time. So getting work done on time and reliable, passing on information, publicly recognizing them, private gratitude, you know, like telling them, thank you so much for counseling me through this difficult situation, listening to them sometimes when they have a little bit of a gripe with the organization or with a donor. Your time is valuable and precious to your manager in the organization. Your technical skills, maybe you have a strength in an area that they don't. That's a way where you can have a currency exchange with them. Okay. So most influential people are the people who do the most for others. And that's what one of the quotes says, right? And we can agree on that, and to the extent that when you're doing more good for folks, more good things happen for you. And I like to look at it in that way. We're not very calculated or transactional as the currencies are making it be, but we know sometimes that eventually we're going to want to cash out on our bank account when we're doing all these extra good deeds that hopefully one day we'll need something that someone will pay us a favor, right? Pay it forward. And that's what we're doing. And I like Julia says, willingness to listen and being unbiased. Yeah. Okay. So influential people, like I said, build a bank account of organizational currencies. And like all good bank accounts, you want to put your bank account and make a withdrawal when you get a chance. Same thing with your family, right? If you're the one that's able to babysit your family members or their pets and have that flexibility, or maybe help take a loved one to the doctor, or you're doing good deeds for folks in your family, it's the same thing. When you need something, when you're sick, you're counting on them to also be there for you. Okay. So it's all about influence. And we do this. We're not, like I said, as calculated or transactional. I want to be like, we're all strategizing how to get the best out of everyone and maximize. But, it's all about influence, right? So the Cohen-Bradford influence model is a model that it's about how to influence those around you when authority is not present. And the gist of their design was to discover what are other people's values, right? Gather those resources and use the collection of the resources to encourage someone to do what you want them to do, or to support you in what you're trying to achieve. So much of knowing how to achieve your goals comes down to influence. But knowing how to communicate, understanding who the person you're trying to influence is, and understanding who you are, all those things we discussed today feed into this influence strategy. So the first thing is assuming all our potential allies, right? Remember, people are good people. And if given the opportunity, they'll want to help you just like you would want to help them, right? So if you don't, you may avoid them. It makes it harder to learn about them. It makes harder for you to bring them on board when you're trying to achieve or work on something. Okay, so understanding who you're working with is super important. Also clarify your goals. What do you want? Do you want long-term relationships, building on, or short-term tasks? What is it that you're trying to work on? And diagnose the world of others. Who do you need to influence? and what do they want based on what you know of them, their personality, and their motivations. So what is the best approach to communicate with them? What is it that they value, right? Let's say you're trying to change a new policy. What is it that they're going to want to see in this policy for them to be supportive of it? Also identify relevant currencies. How can you align what you want with what they want? And what will it cost you to influence this particular situation? Does it benefit outweigh the risks? Are you taking out too much from your bank account to help influence them? Okay, and deal with relationships. Do you have a good relationship with this person? Is there trust? What is their working and communication style? So you know what the best approach is. So this model is a method of influencing people when there's no authority in the relationship between the two. And this influence model is based on the concept of reciprocity, or the idea that each person benefits from an arrangement where one person needs help and can offer something of value for that help. So you need to understand your team in order to know how to motivate them. So for example, you need help with your research for a big project with a deadline that's coming up. Let's say, you know, Roberto is able to do that because he's available this weekend. So you ask him, hey, can you help me out this weekend? I really need some extra hands. But then what is it that you're going to get? So Roberto's trying to, either he has a project coming up or he needs to take time off next week and needs someone to cover. So then you say, okay, I'll cover you next weekend so that you can take time off if you help me with this, right? So it's about what can we offer and how do we help each other? He might not need anything. He says, yeah, sure, you know, I'll help you. But then just know that when he needs something or some support, he's also going to come back because he helped you, right? So we naturally do this without knowing we're doing it. It's just that now we know there's a research model about it, but we've always done this. That's just how we operate as people. So Roberto says, how to know if the values correspond to the same currency? What prefers the euro, does not want the dollar, for example? Right. So let's think about this. Let's take something that happens in our offices often, the holidays. US holidays are very different than the holidays and vacations in other offices or countries that we may work in. So if you're asking someone to work later, maybe on their holiday, so how can you give and take, right? So what is it that they would like? So you ask them, how can I help you? Since you're helping me with this, how can I help you? I want to help you. And they will tell you. You know, sometimes people think of like work travel as like an amazing perk, but some people don't like work travel. They just don't. So how do sometimes organizations compensate for people having to work on work travel or go for long periods of time? There's comp days that they give or offer for the inconvenience of having to be away from home and away from your family, right? There's additional leave days that they may offer, or they may compensate depending on the length of time, some flexibility in not having to work on weekends. So there's different ways, but it's understanding, Roberto, who you're working with. And if you don't know, you need to ask and be open about it. Since you're helping me with this, how can I help you? Okay. So leaders use influence strategy to change their employees' attitudes, their values, and behaviors. And the actual tactics the leaders use vary according to the situation and the desired outcome. So middle management leaders use different tactics to influence their supervisors than they do their subordinates. So it all boils down to, what is your goal? Who do you need to influence? And what is important to them? So you can think a little bit about this on page 19 of your workbook. You can think of a goal that you're trying to achieve and trying to think of who support do you need and how are you going to get them to support. Okay, so there's going to be an influence strategy worksheet on page 19. So take some time if you're working on an actual goal that you want to work on to think through those steps. Okay, so we have a minute spared. We did talk about a lot of different things today, but I'm very interested to know what is one thing you will do differently based on the conversations that we've had so far? You could just drop that in the chat. That'd be really helpful. This is the moment of reflection. I'm getting used to it. Trying to think of everyone's hopes as currencies when I develop proposals to determine and understand their drive. Clarify expectations. Yes, I will try to learn and understand better my boss's world. Yeah, it would help us sometimes understand why sometimes they might be pressing us too much to do something a certain way, or why they're not communicating with us as much as we would like. Make sure I am working to have influence, not just authority. Yes, I think someone put in the question about, are you a good manager when you're something along the lines about, are you a good manager when you're managing with authority? And it's not about authority, right? You don't want people to be afraid of you or see you as a micromanager or the person that's going to always be directing them. You want them to feel empowered. You want them to feel a contributing member of your team. And that's part of the influence, right? Having them believe and build their trust and confidence to deliver the job and be an asset to you and the team. So my intent is when I communicate and ask, use my intent is when I communicate and ask team, how do we would like me to communicate with them? Yeah, if you don't know, just ask, right? Why try to guess what makes people tick when we can just ask sometimes? But sometimes people are obvious. You know what they want, you know what they need, and so you don't need to ask. But the ones that you don't, have that conversation, but create the space, the intentional space to have these informal conversations as well. Okay, so we're 2 minutes over. So sorry about that. Tomorrow we will start same time, same channel, and we will be talking about understanding yourself and others. All right. So unless you have any questions, you can feel free to stay after, but if not, we are done for today and I will see you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.